So I'm Maurice Samuels. I'm the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of this academic year. I urge everyone to sign up for the mailing list of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism and to check our website, which is about to be completely renovated, thanks to Linda, for many exciting events, which will happen, many of them on Zoom, some in person over the course of the year. So check back frequently to look for those. Today's event is very special because it features the new managing director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, Linda Maizels, who came on board at the end of the last academic year. We're really happy to have Linda at Yale and here with us this afternoon to discuss her work on campus antisemitism and the current situation. I'm just going to introduce her very briefly. Linda is a real expert in the field. She published What is Antisemitism? A Contemporary Introduction with Routledge in 2022. And if you're looking for a really even-handed, scholarly, but still readable introduction to the question of antisemitism in the contemporary world, but also historically, this is really your book. It's really an excellent book, I think, to assign to students. If you're looking for just a basic textbook for a class, it also makes a great gift. So I highly recommend it. Linda's doctoral dissertation, which she completed at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, examined the historical roots of contemporary campus antisemitism in the United States. And her master's thesis focused on the internal dynamics of the right-wing Institute for Historical Review, an organization known for promoting Holocaust denial by masking it as scholarly endeavor. Before she came to Yale, Linda worked at the U.S. Department of State, among other places, and taught at Portland State University, among other places. So our plan for today is I'm going to engage Linda in discussion for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to 20 minutes of questions from the audience. We'll try to stop right at 5 o'clock. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and you can submit those questions at any time. I will try to ask Linda as many of them as I can. I imagine, given the subject of today's event, which is campus antisemitism, past and present, that there will be a lot of questions. So Linda, welcome to Yale, welcome today, and let's dive right in.
First of all, Maury, I want to say thank you so much for having this event. Thank you for what is probably one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. And also, I want to do a quick shout out to Inessa Leskova, who's running this, runs a lot of our events. Inessa, thank you for all of your hard work.
Terrific. Okay, so you wrote a dissertation on American campus anti-Semitism. You did this in the early 2000s. You were really ahead of the curve, I think we can say. First to just find out, what made you choose that as the topic for your dissertation? Was there some specific event that triggered it? Or were you, just generally alert to a disturbing trend?
It's funny to look back on your previous choices and think, would I have done that again? I actually, as you mentioned, I had been studying really right-wing anti-Semitism and specifically Holocaust denial in white supremacist and white nationalist groups. And I was living in Israel and I was accepted to doctoral program at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I expected to continue that. But while I was there, the Second Intifada broke out. And that was an experience in and of itself to be in Israel for that. But we also began to see reports of problems on US campuses. And it seemed that the hostility was disproportionately directed at Israel in what was actually a pretty bitter conflict on both sides. So I wanted to learn more about that hostility that we were seeing on American campuses. And I had the unique experience of looking from afar. from watching this from another country. And I also, was thinking of other world events at the time. For instance, the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban and some of the, hostile activity that went on there. And I wanted to try and tie some of that together. So that was the genesis of this idea to work on campus anti-Semitism.
And just curious, how did the professors there greet this, and how did other academics and other historians, greet your work when you finished the project?
That's a difficult question. I had a really terrific advisor, Ellie Letterhandler at the Hebrew University, and he was terrific and supportive. At a time I went into this, I was actually rather naive. I just said, well, this is a question that I want to see answered. I want to see where this came from. And I had no idea that it was going to put me in the middle of a very politicized debate. And Ellie was very supportive, but other professors, I did have one professor at Hebrew U to walk up to me, and you'll pardon the language, but he looked at me, he said, "This is bullshit. There is no longer any anti-Semitism. What are you writing about?" So that was at Hebrew U itself. I came to the United States to do my writing and actually did a lot of my research in the Widener Library at Harvard. They have a huge collection of Jewish student newspapers from the 1960s to the 1990s, and that's the period that I was looking at. I also taught, as you mentioned, at Portland State and at Colby College. And the reaction I got from many other academics was that they were either uncomfortable with or even sometimes openly hostile to the work. The assumption was that I was some sort of right-wing provocateur, and there were lots of variations on "you are a Zionist fascist," essentially. And this is in the early to mid '00s. If I can just, everyone has a difficult time, I think, after they finish their dissertation. Not everyone, but you have to figure out what direction your career is going in. And everyone has issues. I had some unusual problems. For instance, I applied for a postdoc at one point where I was told, "I'm sorry, we only entertain serious scholars." When I went to conferences, it couldn't have been a coincidence. Every time at a conference, I was the last session on the last day, sometimes in a basement or someplace really far away. It was generally me, someone doing Talmud education, and someone else doing some rather obscure topic. No one would attend. And
And these were Jewish studies conferences. So there was like a sort of dismissal of the subject of anti-Semitism within Jewish studies, I think, and within Jewish history, right?
yeah, I think, and I understand, the fears of Jewish studies that they don't want to be defined by anti-Semitism studies. But what I felt was that there was no interest whatsoever. And I knew I was really done and that I was probably never going to be a practicing academic when I got a rejection from a journal that said, a Jewish journal that said, "You write beautifully, but we just don't agree with you." And I thought, okay, now I can take a hint. I can take many hints.
Right. And do you see that changing now in the field of within Jewish history, for example? Or, it seems like there is a new field of anti-Semitism studies that's really getting going.
I agree. And I think what remains to be seen is if anti-Semitism studies what its connections will be to Jewish studies. Will it be separate? Will it be, will it be sort of under the umbrella or the rubric of? And I will tell you that I did speak on a panel at the last Association for Jewish Studies conference. It was on Zoom, but I was not the last day nor the last panel. And I will be speaking again on a panel at the upcoming conference. So I think that we are, coming to some kind of more even-handedness. I have to put in too that this is, of course, when I was writing on left-wing anti-Semitism, writing about right-wing anti-Semitism, no one was interested in that. I think the general thought for people who were doing right-wing, more global right-wing studies, well, the Jews take care of that. The ADL will take care of that. We're more interested in white supremacist problems with, let's say, racism or discrimination against the LGBTQ community, which is, of course, completely valid. But there was not a lot of interest in what I was doing, it felt, on Jews.
Okay, so let's take a step backwards. And, we're going to be focusing on what's going on today on American college campuses. But I think it's important to put that into historical perspective and to not have too you know, narrow a view. I think if we look back over the 20th century, we see, some big changes for Jews on American college campuses. I think, my understanding is that, at many elite private universities, in the Ivy League, including, Yale, there were strict quotas against Jews that came into effect really starting in I think the 1920s and lasted until the 1960s. Is that how you understand it also?
Yes, probably the early 1960s is when the last of those were being sloughed off. But I think the story actually starts in the 19th century because we're looking at Jews' experience at the university, we have to look at the university itself, which in the 19th century was really changing from a denominational focus to a liberal arts focus. We also know that up until the end of the 19th century, the Jewish population was small and many were able to assimilate with some ease into more elite circles. But this changes when you have the more massive East European immigration. And all of a sudden you have eager young Jews who wanted to advance, were succeeding in education and wanted to be a part of the elite college, atmosphere. So you have all of these East European Jews coming in, and by the 1920s, colleges like Harvard, like Yale, felt that they had a Jewish problem. Harvard, by 1925, I think had a 25% Jewish enrollment. Yale in 1921 came up to 13%. And this was clearly seen as disruptive to the type of atmosphere, the type of social atmosphere that Ivy League colleges wanted to cultivate.
Mhm.
So the first step, I believe, was Harvard President A. Lawrence Lowell, who started to enact policies that emphasized, let's say, more subjective factors in bringing in Jewish students or bringing in students in general. So they took geographic factors into consideration. Oh, there aren't that many Jews in Oregon. We'll bring more folks from the West Coast, let's say.
Mhm.
There were interviews to assess character. And through these more subjective tests that were targeted more to the white Protestant elite, they were able to weed out more Jews and certainly, immigrants or children of immigrants. So Yale, I think, probably capped at about 10%.
Mhm.
Other Ivies like Harvard was slightly higher, maybe closer to 15, and Columbia even higher than that.
And these were explicit quotas. I remember my father telling me my father went to Northwestern in the class of 1950, so he was admitted in 1946, and told me that he received a letter saying, "We need to know if you are accepting our offer of admission because we've almost filled our Jewish quota." That it was totally explicit
Yeah,
there.
and I assume that it varied from university to university. I know that there were a lot of Midwestern universities that benefited from the fact that very qualified Jews couldn't attend university on the East Coast, and so they started to come farther out west. Yeah, and the other problem too is even for those Jews who were fortunate enough to be accepted, it didn't mean necessarily that your experience was going to be like your Christian, colleagues and other students because there was social exclusion, of course,
Mhm.
particularly the Ivies with eating clubs, et cetera.
Mhm.
So that could be disappointing. And I think we would be remiss if we did not point out that at the same time, there were certainly limitations on Jewish faculty.
Mhm.
So I think that Yale hired its first tenured professor in 1946 in the philosophy department.
Tenured Jewish professor. Yeah.
Yeah, tenured, tenured
I mean,
Jewish.
there's an excellent book about Jews at Yale called "Joining the Club" by Dan Oren. So we'll give a shout out to that. I mean, so something changed by the 1960s. Universities opened up. What caused that?
I think it was multi-factor, and I'd just like to jump in very quickly with joining the club that I recently find out that Dan Oren and I are distantly related. So that was a nice perk of coming to Yale. After World War II, once again, the purpose of the university is changing. If before it had been to denominational and then liberal arts and educating mostly young men for a certain position in society, post-World War II, we were in the Cold War and we were facing off with the Soviet Union, and there was more of an emphasis on looking at merit. And we want to bring in the best candidates that we can, technology, science, liberal arts, whatever it might be. so that we can win in this competition. This is, of course, also at a time when you have an expansion of students eligible to go to college or go to university through the GI Bill. And also, if you are at all conversant with whiteness studies, this is a time when we talk about expanding acceptable people who are considered more socially acceptable, and white ethnics from Eastern and Southern Europe, so Italians or Greeks or Slavs or Jews, were all of a sudden, many scholars say, brought into that fold of being seen as more authentically white. And of course, there were still social and some assimilation problems, but really what we can see is that by the mid to late 1960s, with quotas going away, with all kinds of opportunity, this was a great era for Jews. They succeeded immensely, and have to this day, as students, as faculty, as staff. The university became a wide open field for advancement within American society.
So, my sense is that I was an undergrad at Harvard in the 1980s, and my feeling was, there was no anti-Semitism there. I felt like, there were, I think the official statistic was 20% Jewish student body. It seemed like even more. It seemed like there really were there was not even a hint of it. I at least didn't feel that. Maybe it would have been different if I were more visibly Jewish, but like wearing if I
Kippah or
was
something.
Orthodox, yeah. But is that your sense that things were that there was a decline of anti-Semitism on campus, and when did that start to change? It seems like if you were writing your dissertation on campus anti-Semitism in the 2000s, clearly you were focusing on something.
Well, this is tricky. And actually, when you're talking, excuse me, about a golden age for Jews on campus, that echoes exactly what it is in the Harvard University Task Force's report on anti-Semitism, that I think that what the authors wrote was from the 60s through the 90s was a golden age for Jews at Harvard. This also matches up, by the way, with, for American Jewish historians would say from the late 40s to the mid to late 60s, that's the golden age for American Jewry, in part because not only was anti-Semitism post-war seen as taboo, and so expressions of that definitely plummeted, but also for the American Jewish community, it was a time before rapid assimilation and intermarriage. So that's another question entirely. And I do believe, Maury, that it was, a great time to be on campus in many places. However, and this is probably where I get fairly unpopular, I think there were definite currents in place that were starting to move rapidly beneath the surface. So if you were a Jewish student not necessarily involved in overt Jewish life, or as you said, you weren't visibly Jewish, there might not be problems, but they were always there. And for me, the turning point as we go from the mid 60s to the late 60s, of course, is the rise of the New Left and countercultural movements. And we have to factor in the aftermath of the 1967 war. And this is where my research came in. And I did a lot of reading within Jewish student newspapers of Jews, young Jews at the time, young adults or students, who were committed liberals. They were on the right side of history, according to their peers, because they supported the civil rights movement in droves, and they opposed the Vietnam War. But they had conflict when it came to the 1967 war, because the New Left was much more to the side of what at the time we would have called not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but the Arab-Israeli conflict, would have been much more supportive of the Arab narrative of events. And for many Jewish students, this was difficult to see themselves as good liberals, except for on this one issue where all of a sudden they appeared out of step. I would also argue that there's a very rapid switch at this time, that if Jews had been thought of as a somewhat undesirable minority on many college campuses up through, let's say, the late 50s, early 60s, all of a sudden, in the late 1960s, not only is Israel typed after the 67 war as a white imperialist nation, but Jewish students on campus are all of a sudden seen as white oppressors. And this produces real cognitive dissonance when you think that just
Mhm.
20 some years earlier, we'd
Right.
gone through the Holocaust, the Shoah,
Right. So the Jews became white, in other words. Yeah.
very
I
quickly.
mean, you mentioned the Harvard report on anti-Semitism that I think came out last spring. I found it very interesting. It's very long, but there is an executive summary. It's available online. I encourage people to look at it because it really provides, I think it's very well done. I think it provides a really interesting overview of the history of Jews at Harvard, but really by extension at, on a lot of college campuses. And one of the things I found most interesting there is that it also sees a turning point, I think, in the early 2000s around related to a shift in protest culture
Mhm.
on campuses. So, according to the report, there had always been a pro-Palestine movement on campuses, but the emphasis had been throughout the 80s and 90s, and I think this corresponds to what I felt when I was there. The emphasis had been on dialogue and on, bridging the gap between, the two sides. Whereas it seems like, according to this report, they're arguing that around in the early 2000s, the emphasis became on anti-normalization. That it was you now, had to, shun the pro-Israel side rather than dialogue with them, that any kind of discussion was considered normalizing the regime in Israel, the Zionist regime. And I should say, I think there's a corresponding demonization of the other side on the Jewish side too. I think there was less, willingness to engage in debate with people who you don't agree with. So do you agree with that finding of the report?
I think that we really see this in the OOs, in part because of the rise of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which I think was a major proponent of saying Israel is a nation that cannot be dealt with at this point. As you said, anti-normalization. To speak with them, to try and reach some kind of a consensus is normalizing, and that's not what we're about. So I think that's part of it. But I want to step back too, that if you look, for instance, at my dissertation, and I'm not recommending that you do that, by the way, but if you did, when we're talking about Jewish issues on campus, really Jewish students, at least in the national publications they're putting out, they're not talking as much about Jewish-Muslim relations. It is there. But what you hear more is Jewish-Black relations. That's an enormous part of my dissertation. So while Muslim representation on campus may have been quieter on some campuses, populations were smaller, with the Black community, you have precursors, I think, of some of this animosity and some of this labeling of Israel and by extension Jews as that we don't want to deal with them. They're not acceptable entities. Maybe not as much with Jews. I think there was some dialogue with Jews, but Israel was already typed as a hands-off entity. And
Mhm.
one of the sort of the portions of the Harvard report, Harvard talks about a piece of recycled propaganda from the 1960s. It was a poster that was put out by the Student National Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and it equated the oppression of Black Americans with the oppression of Palestinian Arabs. And it did so in a pretty crude way. There's, I think, a picture of Muhammad Ali with a noose around his neck, Nasser with a noose around his neck, and there's a large fist with a Jewish star on it. It's a pretty offensive cartoon, and there were quite a few visual representations of these kinds. This was from the 1960s. This was reprinted, evidently, and circulated on the Harvard
Mhm.
campus within the last year or two. The groups that put it up there had to take it down, but you can see the correlation.
Mhm. And do you see this as part of a broader shift in the left in America? So not just on college campuses, but did the left as a whole evolve? I'm thinking here in listening to what you just said, thinking about the rise of intersectionality as a theory, this idea that, all oppressions are linked. And so therefore, if you are for civil rights, you are also for Palestinian, rights and, against, Israel too. Do you see that as a sort of larger trend and what's going on campuses is a subset of that?
Well, I think, when we talk about the left, and everybody uses different terminology for this, but I think of a liberal center. I think that in the post-war, someone like Arthur Schlesinger called it the vital center, that had people that were, lean to the right, lean to the left, and you had extremes of the right and left that we argued against. Today, in my writing, I talk about a more of a hard left that is going to, some segments of it, maybe many segments, are going to be definitely standing against Israel and in some case having an issue with Jews. But liberals, for instance, liberals of both the right-leaning and the left-leaning type I don't think that they necessarily have. They might have criticism of Israel, which, as we know, is just fine. They might have complaints. They might be very angry, but they are not in a mode where they, for instance, want to promote anti-normalization. Nothing like that. So when we say, has the left changed? For me, I don't know if it's changed. I think that some of it has intensified, and there are a number of reasons why. And in part, we have to, of course, bring up the rise of social media. We can see it now.
Yeah.
In the time that I'm researching, students who wanted to put out a national paper had to write away to people around the country, get articles in, create a physical paper, Xerox it, send it out to everyone. Now it's immediate, it's instantaneous.
Yeah.
And what that means, and just like the old Twitter, now X, hot takes that you can put out there.
Yeah, and there are also algorithms that make sure that you're only seeing content that you already agree with, so that is a big difference too.
Yep.
So, okay, let's talk about October 7th and the aftermath. First of all, did anything surprise you about what happened on American college campuses after October 7th? Or was it all just what you already had predicted in your dissertation?
I feel like I'm sort of Cassandra here, wailing in the darkness, and no one was listening. Listen, again, I think you can always see currents and you can see trends. And I thought that I could certainly see the precursors of this. When I was in Israel for the Second Intifada and what I saw going on campuses, I thought that was the worst. I thought we couldn't get any worse than that. And indeed, many people agreed with me. There's a bunch of books that come out about it at the time, many of them talking about a new anti-Semitism that really wasn't that new. So when I actually, I was working for the State Department. I was in Kyoto, Japan, when I found out about October 7th. I'd been on a plane with no communication. I found out because a neighbor texted me saying, "I'm sorry about what happened in Israel," and I had no idea. Then I started to read the reports, and again, it felt very familiar, particularly from the Second Intifada, but also from before. But the intensity is what struck me. The anger, it just seemed so visceral and raw. And when you had, again, we'll use a Harvard example, even though I want to stress that lots of campuses had issues, that within 24 hours, you had 30 student groups putting out a statement saying, essentially ignoring Israeli pain and death and saying, this is Israel's fault.
Right. I mean, I do want to push back a little bit because I think at Yale, it was a little bit different. This is before you got there. I think it was very notable, I think at Yale, that the student groups did not do that. There was one Yale faculty member who put out a very similar statement, to the extent that I almost felt like it was pre-written by, some organization. But in general, no department issued a statement blaming Israel for October 7th like we saw in other campuses. So I think it's important to, make those distinctions too.
Maury, let me just, and I probably should have done this at the start.
Yeah.
Whenever I talk about anti-Semitism in any form, in any era, we know that it's not an entire society. It's not that entire group. We know that some campuses didn't have issues or had minor issues. Other campuses dealt with issues very well, encouraging dialogue. Other campuses had real problems. And of course, in the first days after, it seemed as if everything that had been happening after the second Intifada had been taken up to 11, essentially. But certainly, it never is every campus. And this is a good time for me to jump into and say, I do believe that we have a problem with animosity towards Jews, anti-Semitism on campus. But, and I know this from the Yale students I've spoken with, I think that the Yale students, and admittedly few, they say that their experience at Yale has been good. There are a number of reasons that they have felt comfortable as a Jew and or as a supporter of Israel or a Zionist on campus. However, and this is something we can incorporate into our discussion, what bothers them is that many of them feel that they self-censor, and I think that's more than Jews, and it's all kinds of people, but certainly with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what happened after October 7th, there were a lot of Jews saying that they didn't feel comfortable displaying their identity or talking about their support for Israel. That's where I think we have a problem.
Yeah. I mean, definitely heard things also about Jews who felt like Jewish students who felt like they had to scrub their social media sites to get rid of those pictures of the trip to Israel that they took with their family 5 years before, or, any sign of, support for Israel in order to gain social acceptance. That's the kind of thing I heard, fairly frequently at Yale, and I think that that's, true more widely. I don't think it was the case that Jews on campus felt unsafe. I think that's a misconception that people had. I think there were questions of social acceptance, but I don't think there was like a fear for physical safety for the most part. There were maybe a few small incidents.
That's, by the way, the impression I have as well. If you read, a number of universities have issued reports, Columbia, Harvard, Stanford, I think the University of Washington, and those are, those are campuses that may have had either more severe problems than Yale, or they were simply handled differently. Because another part of this, this is I think important to bring up, is that at the beginning of my research, when I'm looking in the post 1967, really the issues are between student groups, let's say, or between students and other extracurricular activities. I think where this intensifies is when faculty or staff or the administration either are overtly anti-Israel or are not quite sure how to deal with the problem, and therefore they just let it fester. So I think that's what we see in the decades after the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do think is the case at Yale and at other places is a lot of confusion, or I would say misunderstanding, around the concept of Zionism. And for, I think, a lot of students on campus, they think Zionism means you want to kill Palestinians. That they think Zionism means you are for genocide. They think Zionism means you support Netanyahu. I've heard that from even some Jewish people I know who say that. Whereas I think most Jewish people think Zionism means the right to Jewish national self-determination. And so which is pretty central to the identity of a lot of Jews. So I think that that's one of the sources of, conflict. So it doesn't always, I think manifest in, violent ways on campus. So parents who've heard that Yale is this, violently anti-Semitic place, not true. But is it true that there's a sort of deep suspicion and I would say misunderstanding of Zionism? I think that might be true. What's your feeling?
Yeah, I think that for me, when I talk about this, I think there are three terms that people, Americans, let's say, are unclear about. First of all, what is anti-Semitism? And that's a difficult question on its own. What many people don't realize is that animosity toward Jews has a very long history. And one of the things that the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism is here to do is to study anti-Semitism in all geographic areas and all eras. And actually, Maury, I have to say, I think that's one of the things you've done really well over the years, is bringing in all of these different viewpoints and really exposing people to what anti-Semitism writ large looks
Yeah,
like.
I mean, I'll just say that, to me, I think especially in this moment when the anti-Semitism is being wielded and, by people on all different political sides, often in ways that I think distort what anti-Semitism is, I think it's really important to have a program that looks at it as a serious academic subject worthy of study. And that's what we're trying to do, and trying to show our colleagues and our students that you can do that. That it doesn't have to be this political football in a way. Yeah.
Agreed. And if maybe Americans in general don't have a good sense of what is anti-Semitism, I think there are two other terms that they also are not clear about. What or who is a Jew is important. In America, for a number of historical and other reasons, Jews were defined and defined themselves primarily as a religious community. But we also know that Jewishness can mean ethnicity, it can mean culture, it can mean
Mhm.
civilization. And so I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding of what can be hurtful or what can be prejudicial against Jews if you don't know.
Right. I mean, also to just interject there, like who is a Jew? I think in America, we think of, because most Jews are Ashkenazi, we think of Jews, looking a certain way. But if you go to Israel, that's certainly not the case, that you can't be in Israel and think that Jews are a race there. It's an incredibly diverse population, who make up.
And of course, the racial designation was tainted by accusations by the Nazis, who used racial science to determine that Jews were a non-white race. There has been some interesting research on DNA links and
Mhm.
between Jews and others, but that's not my area of expertise, so I won't go there. So if we don't know what is anti-Semitism and who are the Jews, the last term, which you brought up, is Zionism. And I think it has become a slur in the way that people might have said Jew in the past. It feels funny to say that. It feels like a bad word. Zionism, as you said, at its most basic, is the self-determination of the Jewish people. It's
Mhm.
actually more accurate, some scholars would say, to talk about Zionisms. Zionism had a lot of points that different scholars or different supporters of Zionism had very different approaches on all kinds of things, even whether there should be an actual physical state, where it should be located, what to do about relations with Arabs in the area. And of course, there was a wide range, ranging from far right solutions to far left solutions. Zionists were communists, they were socialists, they were more hardline on the right wing. Um, there are Zionisms, and actually Gil Troy wrote a book called The Zionist Ideas, which is an update of Arthur Hertzberg's original Zionist idea. And it brings in all of these varied viewpoints. But part of understanding what is anti-Semitism, who are the Jews, and what is Zionism is then trying to ascertain why Zionism and why Israel is important and an important identity point for many, not all, but many Jews, and at this point, still the majority.
Mhm. Okay. I have a lot more questions, but I promised that we would open it up to
Mhm.
questions from the audience. So I encourage you to, we have a lot, so but please, submit more, and we'll try to get through them. One is, there's been a lot of, writing about Qatari money coming into American universities and creating anti-Israel sentiment. What do you have thoughts about that? Is that something we should be worried about?
Well, it's again, I hate this sounds like such a cop out. It's certainly not something I've studied. I know that money comes in all the time. I remember, and I think I told you about this, Maury, that Turkish money came into Portland State when I was there, and the Armenian community was not happy about that. And there were loads of negotiations and discussions about how to have a position. That specialized in Turkey that would not be problematic for the Armenians. So
Mhm.
interest groups always rise up. I haven't had the opportunity to be affiliated with the university in so long, so I'm probably not the best person to answer.
Mhm.
I think that some money does come with strings, and I think it is the responsibility of the university and sometimes probably outside groups to make sure that the money is for strictly academic purposes.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that the university might, take money from different places. I don't personally know whether they get it from Qatar or not, but they're very clear that they can't influence academic, freedom. One thing that I, just want to make very clear. I have never, I've been running this program since 2011, and never did any administrator or, any colleagues try to influence what kind of subjects we can take on, what we can talk about, how we should talk about it. So that has just never been, an issue at all. So I think, to put that one to bed.
Maury,
So,
really
yeah.
quickly, I think it's a question that I asked you when you were interviewing me about
Mhm. Yeah.
donor influence, and you gave me the exact same answer. No,
Yeah.
we are independent to study this as we wish, and there's never been any pressure in that
Yeah.
in one direction or the other.
A question whether you see any difference in the role of faculty versus students when it comes to campus anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, this is, faculty is faculty and administration is a totally different Zoom, I suppose. But I think we need to talk about the pressures on faculty. Now, there are a number of reasons that I didn't get a job in academia, and some of them are my own fault. I'm not in any way blaming mysterious external forces. But there are enough faculty who, because of the political leaning of a department, say you're studying in English or philosophy or whatever it might be, you might need to, if you're looking for tenure, which most academics are, you might need to bury your own actual feelings until you get tenure. And then some tell me that by the time you get tenure, you're too tired to be much of an activist. But I think that there are pressures on junior faculty and on graduate students to hide their own feelings about this subject, and they certainly cannot write about them. For
Mhm.
many people who are obviously smarter than me, pick the subjects that they write about with an eye to how will this help me or hurt me in employment. And
Mhm.
particularly in the OOs, when you had academic associations that were adopting BDS resolutions, that was very difficult too. So I just want to put that in that, faculty have
Yeah.
their own pressures, and particularly junior faculty. Plus, for when you have on the other side faculty that are espousing their views on the conflict, whatever that might be, and presenting that from a position of relative power as a truth rather than a theory or an opinion or a thought, that's going to have outsized influence on students. Then when you get into student life, well, we've heard a lot about that, about social exclusion and shunning that takes place in the social life of a university. And even more than that, you can hear stories of students, for instance, applying to, maybe they want to be on student government, maybe they want to be in a dance club, and being rejected, not because of their dance abilities or their political abilities, but because you're a Zionist and we don't know if we can trust you. We've heard enough of that. So it can affect on a social level in the classroom, and also certainly on an extra or co-curricular level. And the problem then being, Jewish students have recorded that they felt that when they took their concerns to staff, either staff were not trained to understand the problem. So I
Mhm.
think that all of these build on each other. But again, in the 60s or 70s, maybe even into the 80s, this was really much more of a student on student problem. Probably in the 80s, you really start to see more of this where faculty and staff get involved.
Mhm. Mhm. And I would just add to that since October 7th, there is a Jewish Student Life Committee, and there's also an Arab and Muslim Student Life Committee. And both of them frequently meet with administrators and students. And, I'm on, the Jewish Student Life Committee. And, I can say that the administrators are, very attuned to potential anti-Semitic incidents on campus. And, there's a robust reporting mechanism that I think all students are aware of, and procedures to follow if any, if you're discriminated against in any way. This is, part of, Title VI, and the university is, bound and takes this very seriously. Which leads me to my next question, which other people have suggested too, is something they want to know about, and that's the question of DEI. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that these programs on campus to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion really expanded, I would say, in the last few years, but have now come under fire. And I think Jews, some Jews especially, are very suspicious of those programs because they think either that they openly promote, assimilate Jews to a kind of white privilege, or they just ignore Jewish concerns. But is that your impression? It's frankly not my impression based on the extensive contact I've had with the DEI offices at Yale. I think it's really the opposite of that. But what's your opinion?
Well, I think that we have the sort of the expansion. I think the expansion of this starts in the 80s and really 70s, 80s, and when we use different words, we talked about multiculturalism. And
Mhm.
even then, what you had Jews who I think were in the main supportive, as I am, with this idea of equity. How can we oppose the idea of equity and inclusion and making students feel that they belong? That's really important. And a shout out to my DEI colleagues on this campus, a few of whom I've met. I think that the difficulty is that, and this starts really, I think, back in the 60s as well, that Jews were, as they were seen more as representative of white privilege, DEI was focused on other groups, Black Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and also women's studies groups. But if you go into campuses today, what you'll often see is these either those academic departments or those supportive centers for students. They might cluster together, whereas Jewish centers and the Jewish Studies program are very different. And for
Mhm.
studies programs, that was by design. Professors like, I think Robert Alter said, we don't want to be an ethnic studies
Mhm.
discipline. We want to be part of the Western canon, which probably worked at a certain point, but the university changed. And
Mhm.
ethnic studies, departments and area studies grew. And all of a sudden, Jews realized that they were really left out of this discussion. Again, they were seen as part of the white establishment. And in many ways, and I've said this often, I'll say it again, Jews have been enormously successful at all levels in the university. It makes sense that Jews are seen as part of the establishment.
Mhm.
However, if we disregard thousands of years of anti-Semitism, which they've done great things in thousands of
Mhm.
years and experienced great discrimination. If that is ignored, if Jewish students' present day needs, whether it is kosher food, whether it is holidays, getting time off, whether it is their attachment to Israel, all of those things, those are diverse viewpoints and those are diverse needs. And when I taught a seminar, I was part of a seminar up at Brandeis where we were actually working with DEI professionals who were terrific. And one of them said to me, I know we're not getting this quite right on Jews. I want to get it right.
Yeah, and I would say that I just did the new DEI training or inclusion training at Yale, and it does include anti-Semitism, I think, for the first time in it. So and we were consulted about that too. So yeah, my feeling is I think it's important to work to include Jews within the DEI framework. I think that's.
That's what I don't, it shouldn't, I don't want it to become a comparison. I don't want it to become a who's suffered worse. I think if we have students who need assistance and are, I think that their complaints or their concerns should be assumed that they are being given in good faith. I think that's one other very important. I know on Columbia, there was an episode where there was some kind of a presentation on anti-Semitism where people who were in charge of student life were texting to each other and saying, this is obviously a play for money, for attention. These are privileged people. And it was clear that the people who were in charge of student life assumed that these complaints were being made in bad faith. I think with all students, we need to assume that they are honestly hurting and honestly need support.
Yeah. So one person is asking, please explain what the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism is. Is it a department? No, it's not a department. We are a program, and we're located within the Whitney Humanities Center. We mostly organize lectures and conferences. We have 2 postdocs who teach classes related to anti-Semitism. We, try to promote the discussion of anti-Semitism within the university, but we don't offer a degree, for instance, unlike a department. So we work in concert with the Jewish Studies department, or that's actually a program too, but it's more like a department. That, does offer, courses, and it's a major, for instance. And so we work with them. We also work with the Slivka Center, which is the Hillel on campus. And I think that we all have a slightly different purview. So we're an academic program, so we bring scholars to campus. So does the Jewish Studies program. They're more focused on Jewish studies in general, whereas we have a more narrow focus on anti-Semitism. So that's how I would break that down. So here's a question. In your opinion, is there another major U.S. university that has more effective policies to address anti-Semitism? And what are they doing that's so effective?
I certainly haven't done a case-by-case study of many different universities. I did read something interesting in the Atlantic recently that said that some Jewish students, not all, are choosing to head to the South because they feel they might have gotten accepted to an East Coast university or West Coast university. But the South has been, in many ways, schools like Vanderbilt, like Emory, et cetera, they've been quiet now, that or quieter. That may be because of the students that they attract. It may be because of sort of the geographical feel, the cultural feel, and it may also be that the administrators feel empowered for whatever reason to shift behavior more than they might have in the West and East Coast. I know that Dartmouth has won praise also for its handling, and I think that also Yale has won, gotten some accolades for what it has done. What I see and what I think is the most important. Actually, I have several thoughts. One of them is that while we need to recognize that protest is a very important part of American culture, it's been effective. We have a long-standing history of this, and also our support for freedom of speech. But I think the universities that have been successful have recalled that the main focus of the university, its purpose, is education. And that's an open education for all of its students. And while voicing opinions is extremely important, we need to remember time, place, and manner regulations, and to understand that if I feel very passionately about something, then the person across the way might feel the opposite very passionately about that same subject. So I think those universities that have emphasized, yes, of course you can protest, but like anything else, it must be done appropriately. I can use one quick example from Portland State University, where unfortunately a library was taken over, and damage was done. I think maybe in the millions, I don't know. And the mayor of Portland at the time, Ted Wheeler, said something along the lines of, I fail to see how damaging a library in Portland, Oregon, and barring other students from entering will do anything at all to help the conflict in the Middle East, to help Palestinians, to help Israelis. And
Yeah, it's a
that's,
tricky thing because, there's a kind of logic of student protest, which is to push the boundaries.
Mhm.
So, and I think where a lot of universities got in trouble is when they didn't follow their own rules, that they had about time, place, and manner restrictions for protests. Maybe some of them didn't have rules, but some did and then didn't follow them. And then you're in a very difficult position because then you're not following them for some people. Then, are you going to start following them for other people? And, that seems to be not, that's where I think a lot of people went wrong. And I think you're right that the schools who said you can protest, but you can't block the library. You can't take over the library. You can't do it all night so students can't study for exams. Those campuses, I think, did a little bit better. And I get that students want to push those boundaries to get attention. So administrators are in a very difficult position. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just add also disrupting classes. So if you have a class taught by an Israeli professor and that you feel is your time to come in and read a manifesto, that's not fair to the
No,
professor, it's not fair to the students.
the students. Yeah.
We need to keep in mind too that it was much more clear in the 50s and 60s and before that when the university acted in loco parentis and felt that it was the parental authority. Certainly by the end of the 60s, this has gone away. Plus the fact that, let's face it, students pay a lot of money to be here. In some respects, and I used to work in housing departments, students are thought of as customers, sometimes more than students. And if you have a paying customer, it's hard sometimes to tell that customer
Yeah.
no. And I think the universities need to assert more of their control in that area.
Yeah, so we have a lot more questions. Just very quickly, how do Jews of color fit into this equation? That's something, on the Jewish Student Life Committee, we hear from, Jews of color on campus who I think have a, especially difficult time sometimes because they're expected that they, to fit into a certain category and to have certain beliefs. And then when they don't, they're shunned, and that is a real problem that needs to be addressed. I don't know if you have other
Yeah, I
thoughts.
think we saw in the Harvard report that certainly Arab citizens of Israel had a similar problem. What
Right.
box did they fit into? This would be a great time. I think we're running out of time. I was hoping to tout some of the great programs we have coming up, but people should know that we have the Barron Grant program where we do support student research. And I think we have two different undergraduate, maybe graduate students that are doing research on how these issues affect students of color. So stay tuned because we will be, highlighting some of this research in the spring. And if that's a question of yours, hopefully it will be answered.
Another question is, has Yale acknowledged or apologized for the decades of discriminatory quotas? That's a really good question. To my knowledge, I have not ever seen an official acknowledgement or apology, and maybe that's something that we need to think about.
Well,
Um,
I wonder if part of the issue is that, we're still fighting about quotas today. Jews don't come up as much, but certainly there have been cases about Asian American students, for instance. So
yeah,
we are still thinking about that,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Okay, final question because we are out of time. How do we get on your mailing list? You go to the website for the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, YPSA, and there should be a link on the website to sign up for the mailing list.
There
So,
is. I
yes.
guarantee it.
There is. Anyway, so this is clearly, I think we're going to have to do this again sometime because there were, many, many questions that we didn't have time to get to. I apologize to everyone, but hopefully you found this informative. And Linda, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to, the hundreds of people who came on this afternoon to talk about campus anti-Semitism. So stay tuned for many more events and thank you all and happy end of summer.
Thank you.